For 600 years, one being worked patiently to erase a kingdom from the map. He succeeded, and then, more than 1,000 years later, that same vanished kingdom reached out from the grave and finished him off. That's the strange, almost poetic shape of the Witch King's story. And most people only know the ending. They know the cloaked figure on the fell beast, the blade at Weathertop, the gates of Minas Tirith caving in under his mace. What they don't always realize is that this is the final scene in a saga nearly 3,000 years long, one that starts with a man, runs through the death of an entire civilization, and ends with that civilization's ghosts settling the score. A name lost to history. Here's the first oddity. Nobody knows who he was. Not his name, not his homeland, not even with any certainty what people he came from. All we know for sure is that he was once mortal, and that he was one of 9 men important enough to be handed a ring of power by Sauron himself. That detail alone says a lot. Sauron wasn't in the business of giving rings to farmers, whoever this man was. He commanded something, a throne, an army, a territory of his own. Guesses have ranged from a Númenórean nobleman to a chieftain among the Easterlings, but Tolkien never tells us. And in a way, that's the point. Whatever name he carried in life, it was already gone by the time the story we know begins. What's left isn't a person. It's a warning about what's left of a person after enough power and enough centuries. The slow poison of the 9 rings. The terrifying thing about the rings of power is that they didn't feel like a trap. They felt like a gift. The 9 men who accepted them got exactly what they were promised: wealth, influence, kingdoms that thrived, and lifespans that stretched on long after their peers had died. For a while, it must have looked like the deal of a lifetime. But every year they wore those rings, something else was happening underneath. Their grip on the physical world loosened. Their need for Sauron's power grew. They stopped aging the way other men did, and then they stopped being visible the way other men were. By the time the process finished, there were no kings left at all. There were only the Nazgûl, 9 wraiths with no will of their own, fully absorbed into Sauron's. By roughly the year 2251 of the Second Age, they'd stepped fully into the open, their old lives over for good. One of those 9, though, was about to become something more than a wraith among wraiths. Sauron's right hand. Tolkien never spells out exactly why one ring wraith rose above the other 8. Maybe he'd been the most powerful king before his fall, maybe the shrewdest commander, maybe simply the one who surrendered to Sauron's will most completely. Whatever the reason, by the Third Age the answer was clear. This was the one Sauron trusted above all others, the leader of the 9, the commander of his armies. He would come to be known as the Witch-King of Angmar. When the last alliance brought Sauron down at the close of the Second Age, plenty of people in Middle-earth breathed a sigh of relief, assuming the danger had passed for good. The Nazgûl, though, didn't die with their master's defeat. They simply waited, and the Witch-King, patient as ever, was already looking north toward an opportunity. Building a kingdom to kill a kingdom. Around the year 1300 of the Third Age, a new realm appeared north of the Etenmoors, Angmar. It wasn't built to be admired or to grow rich. It was built as a weapon. By this point, Arnor, the great northern realm founded by Elendil himself, had already split into 3 squabbling successor states: Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudor. Each claimed the old kingdom's legacy, but none of them trusted the others enough to stand together. The Witch King looked at that fractured map and saw exactly where to apply pressure. He understood something most conquerors don't have the patience for. Kingdoms rarely fall to one decisive battle. They fall because someone spends years, sometimes centuries, quietly engineering their collapse. That's the project he set in motion. 600 years of slow strangulation. Rudor went first. Its Dunedain rulers pushed aside until the kingdom was effectively an extension of Angmar. Cardolan held on longer, but war wore it down, and when the Great Plague tore through Middle-earth, it finished the job the Witch-King hadn't needed to start himself. He simply made sure the survivors had no room to recover. That left Arthedain, the toughest of the three, fighting almost alone to keep what remained of Elendel's legacy alive. Generation after generation of its people resisted, knowing full well they weren't just fighting a rival kingdom. They were fighting something that didn't age, didn't tire, and answered to a power most of them couldn't even comprehend. In response, the smiths of the dying kingdom did what desperate people have always done. They made better weapons. Specifically, blades worked with old protective magic, designed for one purpose: to hurt the unnatural things commanded by Angmar. Nobody making those blades knew it at the time, but they were forging something that would outlast their entire civilization, and that would one day end up buried quietly in the Barrow Downs. By 1974 of the Third Age, after nearly 6 centuries of grinding warfare, it was over. Fornost, the capital, fell. Arnor, the kingdom Elendel's line had founded after the fall of Numenor, simply ceased to exist. Its cities emptied, its royal line scattered into obscurity. The Witch-King had done something even Sauron rarely managed. He had taken an entire kingdom and erased it. A coalition of Gondor, elves, and the last Dunedain marched north the following year and broke Angmar at the Battle of Fornost, driving the Witch-King from the field. As he fled, the elf lord Glorfindel made a prediction that would hang over Middle-earth for the next 1,000 years. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall. At that moment, it must have sounded almost beside the point. He had already won the war that mattered. A second life in Mordor. The Witch-King simply went back to Sauron and kept working. If anything, his most consequential era was still ahead of him. His next great achievement was the fall of Minas Ithil, the beautiful Gondorian city whose name meant Tower of the Moon. Under his command it was captured, its people driven out, and over the following centuries it was twisted into something else entirely. Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, glowing sickly green on the edge of Gondor's borders as a permanent reminder that the enemy hadn't gone anywhere. From Minas Morgul, the Witch-King ran operations for generations, directing strategy, grinding down Gondor's strength bit by bit, waiting for his master's return. When the One Ring finally resurfaced, he was the obvious choice to lead the hunt. He chased the hobbits across Eriador, wounded Frodo at Weathertop, and eventually rode at the head of Sauron's army toward the very city his old enemy's descendants still called home. The debt comes due. At the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, the Witch-King looked for a moment genuinely unstoppable. He smashed through the gates of Minas Tirith and brushed aside everything in his path, telling Gandalf flatly that no living man could stand against him. He had no idea his death had already been arranged by people he thought he'd erased 1,000 years earlier. On their way to Rivendell, the hobbits had passed through the Barrow Downs, where Tom Bombadil armed them with ancient blades pulled from forgotten tombs, the very weapons forged generations earlier in the long war against Angmar. Without that war, those blades never get made. Without Arnor's fall, they never get buried. Without that burial, Merry never picks one up. When Merry drove that blade into him from behind on the Pelennor Fields, it wasn't just a wound. The old enchantments worked into the steel tore at the dark sorcery, holding the Witch-King together. Tolkien himself notes that no other weapon, however powerful the hand wielding it, could have struck a blow that bitter. Weakened and reeling, he was finished off by Éowyn, fulfilling Glorfindel's prophecy in the most literal way possible. Not a man's hand at all. It's hard to overstate how much damage one figure did to the history of Middle-earth. He toppled an entire kingdom, turned a city of light into a city of horror, ruled from its dark tower for centuries, and led Sauron's armies in the war that nearly ended everything. And yet the story turns out to be a tragedy, as much as a horror story. A man who started with ambitions ordinary enough to imagine, ended up with no name, no face, and no will of his own, just an extension of someone else's. The kingdom he spent 600 years grinding into dust turned out to be the one thing patient enough to outlast him. He destroyed Arnor. In the end, Arnor returned the favor. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Witch-King of Angmar, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think he was before becoming a ringwraith? And what fantasy legend, kingdom, or character should we explore next?